Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this week's edition of 2-Minute Warning. And I'm delighted this week to be joined by Mr. 𝗔𝗟𝗟𝗜𝗚𝗏, who's the Chief Commercial Officer of Uniper. Thank you, Nick, for joining us today.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Great to have you. I think, Nick, we'll start with sort of a bigger picture sort of question, if you like, point of view, and zero in a bit on Europe, where, of course, we've seen it's a continent that has, massive plans for large-scale electrification of its energy sector, mostly through renewables. And I'd like to just sort of start by asking you where we're at on that journey. Of course, Europe is still very much, its energy sector and energy supply is very much fueled by traditional fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas. But clearly a lot of money and investment and funding going towards electrification. Where are we at on that journey in terms of Europe?
Yeah, very good question. And I mean, it's certainly an issue that Europe is struggling with as we speak, frankly speaking. I mean, integrating a large percentage of renewable energy into the power system is not something that can be done overnight. And we're experiencing that with rising levels of renewable energy generation. I think integration only comes at low cost when you have sufficient interconnection and also sufficiently flexible grids. And for that reason, cross-border electricity connections, actually, they have been a central point in the evolving EU legislation over the last couple of years. But I mean, if you look at the current situation, then the grid is barely coping actually nowadays. So let alone if we deliver on the increased decarbonization, the increased electrification ambition, because that will imply that power demand overall will obviously grow, but also the percentage, the share of renewables will grow. Mm-hmm. And I think already right now, grid connections are becoming a bottleneck for further expansion, for further build out of renewables. And also within Germany, the country where I work and live, as you know, we are seeing big problems when it comes to transporting, for instance, wind power, which is generated in the north, to the pockets of demand in the south of the country. And that requires big investments actually for us to get there. But maybe one additional comment, stepping away from the grid and the interconnection, there's also, I think, solutions that one can think of, like batteries or also demand response, so reducing consumption in times of oversupply. And we just need to work on all of these aspects in order to keep the power supply secure, obviously, but also affordable.
Yeah, well, you mentioned a couple of interesting points there. I'd like to just touch on the interconnection capacity point that you pointed out, and that obviously still has its challenges. And of course, we need to make sure that, as you said, the right investment has to go into that. Now, from a policy point of view in Europe, are the policies being attractive, if you like, enough for to facilitate that investment to come in? Do you see any off-putting policies that are not quite in place yet for investors who want to invest in these kind of solutions?
I think what is clear is that we need to accelerate. And in order to accelerate, I think we do need to look at the way that investors, operators, but also optimizers of the infrastructure, i.e. the grid capacity like ourselves, how they are incentivized. And that's a very detailed discussion, but I think there is, I think it makes sense to look into the exact details there. I mean, one example is we're as a power production company in Uniper Power Production also active in Scandinavia. Scandinavia is sitting on vast hydropower reservoir capacity. And there are times where that hydropower is trapped in the Nordics and doesn't find its way to the continent, to continental Europe. So that continental Europe needs to ramp up coal-fired generation in order to meet supply. So the interconnection capacity needs to be put in place. And I think we need to look into the regulatory framework that incentivizes, enables that, because it's clear that the pace is simply too low at this point.
And how important is it that Europe, it is a continent and it's obviously you've got the EU, how important is it that that policy is coordinated, if you like, or can countries individually succeed perhaps better if they sort of go solo?
No, Uniper has always been very much in favor of looking at Europe as one, so looking at one single energy market within Europe. And that's also, by the way, how most of the policy and the policy instrument like the EU ETS, so the carbon pricing system, has been implemented and has been steered. So we very much favor that, and we need European solution. Obviously, climate issues are not local, national issues; they're continental or even global issues. And the same goes with I guess, grid solutions. So it's very much important that we look at this from a holistic European perspective, which we luckily typically do. It's more a matter, I think, of pace than the holistic picture, which is the issue at this point.
And I mean, would you say that utilities worldwide, in terms of their move towards electrification and the whole decentralization of the energy system in general, but compared to other regions, how would you say Europe is doing from a utility point of view in terms of progressing on this front?
I feel we're on the right track. I mean, it's sometimes a bit difficult maybe to make that comparison, but I feel that when it comes to policy, we're definitely directionally, absolutely going the right way. It's a matter of speed. And I also like to think that in terms of using digitalization, if you will, to ensure a smooth, a seamless integration of renewables into the grid, Europe is quite advanced. A lot of algorithmic trading, automation being looked at, clearly looking at what digitalization can offer in order to support decarbonization. So I absolutely feel that Europe is on the right track. And also for Uniper, that is a very integral part of its strategy, both decarbonization as well as digitalization in order to be successful.
Well, I mean, let's talk a bit about digitalization. As you mentioned, that obviously that's a big part of sort of making the sort of decentralization of the energy system in any country or continent work efficiently. Obviously, that's data is a very big part of that in terms of how that's used towards driving efficiencies and optimization. Again, so how progressed are we in terms of that solution, digitalization, using data for optimal efficiencies? And should we be moving quicker on that front, do you think?
I think we should definitely be moving quicker on that front. I mean, speaking about myself, I'm a trained statistician, so I know what you can do with data, and looking at the vast amounts of data available, and also looking at the, I guess, technological advances we've seen when it comes to software, for instance. I think there is so much we can do in order to make that renewables expansion and in order to deliver on the decarbonization ambitions and holistically integrate it into our ecosystem, if you will. So we can definitely pick up speed as a country and as a region, as Europe as a whole, for sure.
And how, I mean, can you give us an example of how it's had an impact on the trading part of your business, if you like, you know, with or without implementing those solutions? What difference has it made to your bottom line?
Well, first of all, we have a very holistic, comprehensive digital agenda, very much focusing around automation of execution. And on the other side, we're also looking into automation of the decision-making processes. I mean, in some of the cases, it's a matter of efficiency, becoming more efficient, quicker sometimes in your execution, and sometimes it's also purely additional value creation. So both, if you look at top line as well as bottom line, I think we wouldn't be as profitable, as successful as we are right now if we wouldn't have pursued these digitalization ambitions.
Okay, I'd like to talk a bit about another sort of big buzzword, if you like, in terms of the whole emissions argument, which is hydrogen. Hydrogen has been around for a long time. It's nothing new, but for some reason in the last year or so, and perhaps COVID sped it up, or the whole environmental emissions argument has, as we know, had a big lift in the last year with all the other disruption that we've seen in the industry, if you like, for other reasons. But hydrogen is nevertheless picking up investment, it's picking up attention. It's certainly on track to play a much larger role in the solution towards cutting emissions. Can we start by asking you, what is the economic argument behind any investors who are actually pursuing the argument for hydrogen today? What is the economic argument for it?
I think, first of all, the buzz in principle is good, because the buzz creates energy, it creates excitement, it also creates a change in mindset, I think, in some of the cases, and it also, frankly speaking, stimulates policy changes, and these policy changes are very much required in order to establish that regulatory framework that enables investments, right? That was one of your questions. And I think what is also important to note is that we shall look at LNG and hydrogen as two complementary products or commodities, if you will, right? Sometimes the decision is very much about it's either the one or the other.
Yeah.
Both, I think, have their role to play when trying to work towards carbon reduction targets. And I think what is crucial for the future acceptance for LNG also is that we work on decarbonization of the LNG value chain. And gradually, I think hydrogen will ramp up and will be complementary to and gradually taking over the place of LNG or natural gas. But then we're really talking about a decade from now. So I think for the time being, it's really quite complementary. And for hydrogen, I think what is important at this very point in time is that hydrogen gets out of the laboratory, if you will, right? That we get a true hydrogen economy emerging. And the discussion focuses a lot on supply and on technology, right? And the variants, the different colors of hydrogen. But we also should be very mindful of the fact that we also need demand in order to get the financials to stack up. And I think the demand side definitely still needs to be further developed when it comes to hydrogen as well.
Okay, and you mentioned obviously LNG and how they can both work in complement, if you like, to each other for now, and then obviously long term that might change. Where are we at with the sort of decarbonization of LNG? If you're implying in your earlier comment that hydrogen is not a threat to that necessarily today, but how progressive are we being in terms of that journey? Very important for the shipping industry, potentially, for example. And so where are we at with that? And again, is policy supporting the investment and focus that's needed for that?
Yeah. Well, I think we're on a good track, but it seems to be the theme of this discussion. We can go faster, and I think we should go faster. Looking at LNG, it's still widely, I think, considered the greenest fossil fuel. But we do see the industry becoming greener as we speak, actually. And what is important is that the industry starts to embrace decarbonization by measuring, reducing, offsetting the carbon footprint that comes with the activities along the value chain. And I think it is also important that the LNG industry as a whole, and we are clearly part of that, progresses in that respect, because LNG needs to stay relevant, and it is extremely important to pick up decarbonization in order to stay relevant in the energy transition. So for instance, we are looking into various partnerships with other companies to develop these kind of solutions and ultimately provide to the customers a lower carbon, or at some point possibly a carbon neutral LNG to support their climate initiatives.
And I mean, you mentioned earlier, and that's in pricing carbon. Obviously, Uniper has a part to play in that in terms of the argument, anyway, globally now for pricing carbon and how should we price it, and can different regions agree on that? Where are we at with that in Europe in particular, and how important is it as a contributor to making progress on these fronts?
I think within the European energy landscape, it's an extremely crucial policy instrument. And I think it has also proven to be effective. For currently, as we speak, we're trading at 50 euros for a ton of carbon, which is a multiple of where we were trading, say, a year ago. So pricing carbon and thereby working towards carbon abatement solutions is really starting to pay off, despite a lot of criticism that I think we've had surrounding this EU ETS introduction so many years ago.
Yeah.
But it is obviously still very much a European policy instrument, whereas climate change is a global issue. So in the future, I would be hopeful that we can find, well, I guess cross-Atlantic, but also global connections in terms of carbon abatement, carbon pricing, because I think that is what the industry, for instance, hydrogen, also needs in order to holistically and globally become a relevant solution for the decarbonization.
Okay, and I can want to stick with hydrogen a bit as well, just in terms of where we're at on that. Germany, for example, has a pretty ambitious plans for hydrogen within its national strategy, if you like, and has committed a lot of funding towards that already, ahead of many other countries in Europe, one could argue. And it's also with one or two other countries in Europe looking at over here where I am in the Middle East for partnerships. Obviously, what the Middle East has to offer here is the renewable power of solar mostly, and the Gulf at least, and is also has its own ambitions on the hydrogen sort of agenda, the Gulf countries, but they are very open to these partnerships that are starting to emerge with the technical expertise, if you like, that's coming from Europe. So how important is that partnership to the capacity targets, let's say, that a country like Germany would like to achieve in terms of generation?
Yeah, it's extremely important. It's very, very crucial. I mean, looking at our projections by 2030, then looking at the demand in Germany for hydrogen, if you look at the country's hydrogen demand versus production, then it's probably only 10 to 20% that will be produced domestically in Germany. That is, so the rest would have to come to Germany via imports. They can either be via pipeline or seaborne. So the importance of having various import options, I think, speaks for itself. And there's a lot of support, as you said, a lot of funding available from the government. We are also working, for instance, on developing a green ammonia import terminal in Wilhelmshaven in the north of Germany, including building an electrolysis facility at that same site. But the potential of the Middle East as a long-term exporter to Europe, elsewhere on the globe, but certainly to Europe and to Germany in particular, is really, really huge. As you said, there is the Middle East is blessed with very high solar irradiation, good wind potential in some of the countries. And there is a vast array of hydrogen, green hydrogen projects being announced in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhabi, Oman, etc. And from our point of view, all of these projects are potential exporters to Europe, to Germany in particular. And we, so Uniper, we see ourselves as a significant off-taker of such hydrogen carrier projects from this region. So I think the Middle East can be one of the world's largest exporters of hydrogen in the future, as it is with hydrocarbons currently, if you will.
Okay, good. Well, that's, yeah, it's clearly on everybody's agenda, and not it's extracting physical investment in terms of research and actual operations, but it's also very much financially being invested in as well. It's being put into all sorts of funds and futures, etc. funds, and so that's definitely a big argument and support for that. Nika, I'd like to just address another sort of general question of, we have obviously been through the last 12 months that we've all been through. The industry has been shaken by COVID, the COVID pandemic, the impact of that on demand, principally for energy. We're clearly at the start of a recovery period globally. Europe's doing quite well, despite the fact that the vaccination drive is a bit slow. All the economic indicators are very positive looking forward from Q2 onwards. America is taking off. Asia is being led by China on very positive growth numbers for this year, all compared to last year, of course. So we saw the demand destruction last year. We don't want to get into that too much. But today, how is the COVID pandemic still impacting demand for LNG and pricing, I suppose, on that front? We saw a few spikes in LNG prices this winter for very technical infrastructural reasons, but how has COVID impacted LNG demand? And today, is LNG as if it never happened?
Yeah, very good question. And looking at the impact on LNG, I think we need to look at demand as well as supply. As you said, pre-COVID, we were probably expecting demands to rise during 2020, 21. I think then we had a very big, unprecedented slump in demand, and the market, I think LNG market has also shown it can correct for that and can adopt to these kind of very sudden demand shocks. But what also happened is that a lot of additional LNG export capacity, which was supposed to come online in the next couple of years, actually all these projects have been put on hold. And what we've now seen over the last couple of months, you refer to it, a bit of a colder spell in Asia, quite some demand, very high spot prices all of a sudden. And right now, so going into summer, I think we have almost a completely opposite picture from last year. So there's very healthy competition between China and Europe for summer cargoes. So it will be interesting to see how the market develops over the coming of months. So I would definitely watch it very closely because it will be interesting. But if you look at the medium-term impact, then I would argue, as you said, we don't need to speak about demand anymore. It's back or even above pre-COVID, so to say. But the supply expansion projects, liquefaction, additional trains have been delayed. So the supply-demand balance overall looks quite a bit different than it would have looked otherwise without COVID.
Okay, well, I think we're going to end on that note, but I just have one more question for you. Again, it's a bit of a geopolitical one. It was a comment because it talks about LNG and gas demand. And one of our guests earlier this week on our show had commented that China, which is of course a big consumer of energy and particularly of LNG, and has various suppliers, but that due to the US-China geopolitical mechanics, it is now beginning to resist taking LNG from any country or those countries friendly to America and relying on other suppliers. Would you say that those geopolitical arguments in general are going to impact the flows of LNG, or is it going to be always a straightforward demand-supply equation?
In all honesty, I think energy has always been subject to a lot of geopolitical influences, if you will, right? It's the same in Europe. So I think that will become a part of the discussion. And ultimately, it's about finding a balance, right? It's not either or. It's not purely the commodity supply, demand, economics that prevail, and it's not purely the geopolitical considerations that prevail. So right now, the agenda, specifically in China, is tilting towards the geopolitical side. And I think we will have to work towards a balance between these two aspects over time. I think that is, to me, that is what makes our industry so fascinating and so interesting. And I'm sure it will continue to be like that in the years to come.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Mr. 𝗔𝗟𝗟𝗜𝗚𝗧𝗜𝗢𝗏, the Chief Commercial Officer of Uniper. Thank you very much, Nick, for joining us today and give us your insights on the topics that we've discussed. And it's great to have you on the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.